Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a recent political broadcast to objectively unpack three highly debated arguments that are currently shaping conservative political commentary over in Australia. So let's just jump right into the source material, shall we? Here is a quick look at our agenda for today. First up, we'll look at the shifting tactics between Hanson and the Greens. Second, we'll break down the current immigration debate. And finally, we'll examine Victoria's looming economic challenges. All right, Section 1, Shifting Tactics, Hanson versus the Greens. So the commentators start off by looking at this recent quote from Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, who describes Pauline Hanson as trying to, quote, slip and slide like the trickiest politician. Now, the host of the broadcast argues that this specific kind of language, it is absolutely not an accident. Actually, they suggest it feels like it was pulled straight out of a focus group, specifically designed to rebrand an opponent in the eyes of the voters. And you know, this perfectly captures a massive tactical shift. For years, Hanson's political opponents leaned hard into framing her as naive or maybe a bit clueless, just a coarse, blunt instrument. But that old strategy, it's basically been thrown out the window. The new playbook is all about painting her as tricky, cunning, and a highly practiced 30-year political operator. It's a very deliberate push to tell voters, hey, don't just look at this shiny object here, look at the calculating veteran behind it. But the broadcaster doesn't just let that framing slide. Commentator Nicole Flint immediately pushes back, raising a pretty interesting counterpoint. She points out that labeling someone a career politician is a really tricky attack to pull off, especially when you yourself have a lengthy political career. Basically, framing Hanson as a 30-year veteran comes off as a bit hypocritical coming from Senator Hanson-Young, given her own long tenure in Parliament. It just goes to show how tactical framing can instantly backfire and invite questions about your own authenticity. Moving on to Section 2, Australia's immigration policy debate. To really anchor their argument here, the commentators drop a massive number on us, 1.5 million. According to Nicole Flint on the broadcast, the current Labour government has let in 1.5 million people in just a few short years. And to put that staggering number into perspective, she points out that this is literally larger than the entire population of Adelaide. By using that kind of relatable geographic comparison, the broadcast really hammers home what they see as the sheer, unmanageable scale of the current intake. But for these conservative commentators, this debate isn't just about logistics or numbers on a spreadsheet. No, it's tied to some deeply held cultural concerns. They point to what they perceive as a dilution of Judeo-Christian values and a disrespect for the Westminster parliamentary system. On top of that, they flag potential threats to equality for women and report that Jewish Australians are feeling particularly unsafe right now. So by explicitly listing out all these factors, the broadcast is actively framing the immigration debate as a cultural crisis, every bit as much as a logistical one. And to highlight the political urgency of all this, the broadcast draws a really direct parallel to the United Kingdom. The host argues that if mainstream political parties just, sweep these immigration debates under the rug and ignore the cultural concerns, it's inevitably going to spark populist uprisings. They point specifically to the political wave surrounding Nigel Farage in Britain as proof. The core takeaway they're presenting is that the genie is totally out of the bottle. If you ignore public sentiment on the numbers and the cultural shifts, you just force the debate underground, which ultimately empowers populist figures who are more than willing to tap into those frustrations. To help clarify the mechanics of this argument, commentator Nick Cater gives us a stark historical contrast. Think back to the political landscape of 2013. Back then, the primary anxiety was all centered around illegal migration, right? But today, he argues, the entire policy focus and the primary challenge have completely shifted over to legal but temporary migration. So the concern isn't really about border control in that traditional sense anymore. It's about the absolute volume of temporary migrants, student visas, and bridging visas that are active in the system right now. And Cater drives this shift home by citing another giant statistic. There is currently a pool of 3 million people in Australia on various temporary visas. 3 million. He argues that this specific, totally unprecedented pool of temporary residents, which he notes just didn't exist like this in the past, is exactly what's making the public feel like the immigration system is fundamentally out of control. It's a numbers game, sure, but it's categorized totally differently than it was a decade ago, which they argue requires a completely new policy approach to manage. Okay, let's shift gears to Section 3, Victoria's looming economic challenges. The host kicks off this final segment by bringing up a pretty startling recent revelation. According to the broadcast, the former Victorian Labour Treasurer, Tim Pallas, actually reportedly sought a federal government bailout on a rescue plan back in 2024. The host uses this specific claim to highlight what they see as severe, deeply rooted economic instability at the state level. It's presented as this massive red flag that directly contradicts the state government's own claims of being financially secure. So what exactly is driving this alleged instability? Well, Nick Cater points out that Victoria has the highest borrowing per capita of literally any state in the country. Plus, he describes the state's spending as just wildly out of control. And to back that up, he specifically calls out the highly controversial financial payouts, basically of just giving money away simply to cancel hosting the Commonwealth Games. When you put all those pieces together, the broadcast paints a pretty bleak picture of a state economy that is in dire straits. This alarming breakdown leads the commentators to pose a crucial structural question. It's one that really forces us to look beyond just state borders. What actually happens if an entire state goes broke? This question completely shifts the framing of Victoria's debt. It's no longer just a localized state-level headache. It suddenly becomes a problem with massive national implications. And the broadcast provides a pretty sobering answer. The Commonwealth ultimately bears the burden. The commentators stress that if Victoria financially fails, it is not just going to be Victorians who suffer. Every single Australian taxpayer is going to bear the economic consequences, simply because the federal government would have to step in to fund any of those bailouts. Just like that, state debt transforms into a highly pressing national issue for everybody. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. We've looked at 3 very distinct pressure points today, all drawn directly from the broadcast: the tactical framing used by political parties, the deep-seated cultural and numerical concerns regarding immigration, and the looming threat of structural state debt. So the ultimate question is, how will these 3 deeply intertwined issues ultimately shape voter behavior in the upcoming Australian elections? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack these complex topics today. Stay curious, keep analyzing the narratives around you, and I will catch you in the next explainer.